Well, we're right on time, so thank you for joining us. We're going to try to keep a very tight schedule as usual and be extremely respectful of our guests' time. Both Craig and Karl have graciously accepted to participate in this week's webinar. So I want to also mention that our webinars are going to be available on our YouTube channel very shortly. So that will be coming up soon. We're working to get all of that set up, so everyone will be able to make reference to it when needed. I also do want to thank, first of all, Michelle, the operations and events manager for the association, as well as the board members. The AFA Canada board members have been working tirelessly in really helping push and provide information and a platform for our industry. So thank you to everyone who's been working diligently on that. We've made some huge progress in the last couple of months. And I'm sure all of you have noticed. If you haven't had the chance yet to wander off to our website, afacanada.com, please do so. There's a number of really great resources. One of the newest projects that we've taken on is obviously, and one of the things we're most proud of is our partnership with the Retail Council of Canada. The Retail Council of Canada provides an enormous amount of resource and information for the retail industry. And in fact, I was quite shocked to understand that the retail sector in Canada ranks as the country's single largest private sector employer and generates approximately about $377 billion in sales last year in 2019. So of course, Karl, nowadays, the Retail Council of Canada, I'm sure, has been working tirelessly with everything going on. So thank you for that. And as far as the Retail Council of Canada as well, and just to give a little bit more insight into the retail industry in particular, there's over 145,000 retail establishments employing 2.1 million Canadians. So this is really, really big. It represents approximately $76 billion in wages and employee benefits annually. So this is probably one of the reasons why the retail sector has really been at the forefront of the pandemic these days and how it's been impacted with the shutdown. So of course, we are very proud of this partnership with the Retail Council of Canada. Those of you, and we have received a lot of comments asking about operational protocols and whatnot. There are incredible resources on the Retail Council of Canada website, so I would encourage you to visit that as well. And of course, if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you check out AFA Canada's Facebook and LinkedIn pages for the latest news and information. Michael, over to you.
Thanks. So a little housekeeping. For those of you who've been on these calls in the past, you'll already know this, but for those that you don't, there's a question function at the bottom of the screen. Please feel free to try and put any questions or inquiries to the people involved. Our panelists are certainly going to do their best to try and answer them as we engage in the discussion. However, just be advised that a lot of them may already be part of the agenda. So today I have the honor of introducing our panelists. So first, let's speak about Karl Littler. You may have seen Karl's name in the media over the last few weeks, as he's the Senior Vice President of Public Affairs for the Retail Council of Canada. Karl is the Head of Government Relations, and he's responsible for addressing public policy issues and advocating the interests of Canada's retail merchants. He has many areas of focus, including taxation, trade, payments, and pensions at the federal level, and along with a broad array of issues at the provincial level. His involvement with the RCC is instrumental in the establishment and implementation of many of our government-funded initiatives. Previously, Karl served in the Office of the Prime Minister as a Deputy Chief of Staff with responsibility for cabinet operations and legislation. So welcome, Karl. Hopefully I got everything right there.
You did. By the way, I'm getting this message that my internet connection may be unstable, which is probably a euphemism for them thinking that I'm unstable. But if I do freeze at any point, it's not the questioning. I will come back. Thanks.
Fantastic. Okay, fantastic. Secondly, we have Mr. Craig Patterson. And many of you who are watching may know Craig and be familiar with him already, as he's the founder and editor-in-chief of RetailInsider.com. and that's one of our most well-read publications in our industry. In addition, he's president and CEO of Retail Insider Media, and when he's not running his media company, he's busy as a writer, a researcher, a retail analyst, consultant, and a public speaker. As a former lawyer, he has a keen interest in real estate, shopping centers, urban planning, and Canadian retailing. And Craig is also the Director of Applied Research at the University of Alberta School of Retailing, as well as a research and special projects consultant with the Retail Council of Canada. So welcome again to Craig. And Janelle, hop in.
All right. Well, lots has happened in the last 2 weeks, primarily with the reopening in Ontario of street front retail. That actually was announced exactly 2 weeks ago today while we were on our webinars, our last webinar session. Craig, Karl, what have been your impressions, or what have you been hearing out there in the market with regards to street front retail reopening?
Craig, why don't you go first?
Yeah, I actually I've done a little bit of walking around here. I haven't gone into too many spaces specifically for safety reasons, I guess you'd say. But so far what we've seen is on Friday, some of these street front retailers were permitted to open. Some of them actually did. We saw lineups of people waiting to get into stores. This is a very good sign. So there was a bit of excitement, pent up demand. People wanted to get out. It was also a very, very beautiful day, certainly in the city of Toronto, but around the country, we'd seen some retailers open earlier. Again, somewhat similar situation. We've had people that are excited to get out into the stores. We've seen all kinds of protocols around health and safety that these retailers are implementing. We are seeing, at least in the short term, some good demand, but at the same time, there is certainly segments of the population which I think are going to be cautious in terms of going out and shopping. But certainly at this time, it's fairly good news. There's a Winners store up the street from where I live. The lineup was, there might have been 100 people in that lineup. So, and those people are shopping. They're not just there to browse. You don't stand in line for no reason. You do it because you've got a purpose, certainly at this time during COVID-19.
Well, I think on an operational basis, obviously it's positive to see that there is some pent up demand. It's interesting that you chose to highlight Winners because, of course, they have extreme difficulty functioning on an e-commerce basis, given the the multiplicity of products they have at any given time. So it's been a very challenging time for them. A lot of people wrestling with protocols. There's guidance out there, but there isn't uniformity, and there isn't even uniformity, obviously between provinces and even in some cases regions within a province. So coming to terms, obviously, with the physical distancing issue, with the just general conduct questions within stores, with the labor piece, and of course, human resources can in some cases be a bit of a challenge in this environment. A lot of people still at home with kids who are off school. There's no daycare, so lots of operational challenges, but certainly some early signs of optimism with respect to consumer demand. I guess I would caution that we are projected to go into a bit of a tough economic environment, and so while we see some early evidence of pent-up demand, obviously some incomes have been impinged over this period. We're not quite sure what the future will hold on the broader economy, so I don't think we can count our chickens yet, but some good early starts.
Mm. That's what we've been hearing mostly from retailers, and also you touched on 2 points operationally. There's some very big challenges with staffing, and of course lack of set determined protocol from the government, and we will touch on that a little bit later on. Michael?
Fantastic. So we have some questions coming in, so we'll just try and address those as we work our way through. So really one thing that is at front of mind is there has been a bit of a change in momentum at the retail landscape for smaller local retailers. And how does this bode for the mall retail versus street retail locations?
Craig, you want to start again?
Yeah. It's interesting because the street front retailers obviously were permitted to open recently. Mall-based stores, those that are say inline spaces or otherwise within enclosed shopping centers, have not yet been permitted to open. We actually thought tomorrow that was going to be the case that they would, but no, it's not the case. To check into that. I think there's going to have to be a government announcement there, certainly for Ontario. Some people were finding, you know, speaking to them, they may be somewhat hesitant to go into, say, an enclosed shopping center, at least in the short term. There could be concerns of, you know, catching the virus. But at the same time, I mean, if you think about it, most of these shopping centers, if they're able to implement spacing, you know, hygiene protocols, whatnot, you know, who can be within that space, which is something we don't see, say, on urban streets. I don't see, say, a huge disadvantage to shopping centers. I am actually surprised that it's taken this much time to get them open. These landlords have certainly been preparing for this in a very good way. So I have been told by brokers that there is currently more interest for those that are still seeing some potential work, interest in street front locations. Shopping centers have certainly you know, gotten the brunt of the more popular retailers for the most part in places in Canada outside of some strong downtowns such as Toronto and Vancouver. But I think that, you know, for the retail that does make it through this and is, you know, moving into the future in years to come, I do think that there is still going to be a place for the shopping center, but there will have to be some changes made, you know, including to access points, you know, the way that people feel comfortable moving through the space. Food courts are going to be a challenge, but food and beverage is going to be a challenge everywhere, considering that there's been a mandated, say, occupancy limit that is in relation to the spacing of people within that particular food and beverage space.
Right. Any insight as to possibly when malls are speculated to reopen?
So I think, you know, just in prep for this call, I was pretty skeptical that malls were going to reopen tomorrow. So you know, this is all about the public health situation. And that's not to in any way negate what Craig has said, which is under the right protocols, there's no reason why an enclosed space couldn't be managed as safely as an open space. So I do think that there probably will be some consideration about protocols around mall reopenings, if it's sooner rather than later. The reality in Ontario in particular is that there have been some sort of, you know, vacillating numbers in respect to new infections over the last few days. They're down again over the last couple, but there were certainly cause for mounting concern, which they think may be attributable in part to Mother's Day family gatherings and so on, and the delayed effect of that. In the end, they're not going, I think, to reopen without some very serious constraints and some determination by public health authorities that this is, you know, first, you know, congregation of people in a closed setting is something that's advisable given, you know, given how many infections there are. There's also some suggestion, I think a little concern today, that the regional public officers of health had actually indicated to the province that they might want to see a regional reopening. And so there are areas of the province that are relatively light as far as COVID-19. Obviously within the GTA, there's a significantly greater share, both in absolute numbers and as population share. So it is possible that the province may take that advice seriously. I think we would probably counsel against that. I think our belief is that this is manageable in a safe way with appropriate physical distancing and sanitization. But it is, you know, it's a bit of a sort of fin in the water that there are talks about it. And of course, that is the case in Montreal, that the rest of Quebec is, you know, largely opened and much more constrained on the island of Montreal.
Right, as they're considered I guess the biggest hotspot right now. So interestingly enough, with the resumption of business, we've been finding that certain businesses are now charging what they call as a COVID-19 surcharge, whether it be, you know, to contribute to additional operating costs or sanitization services. Is charging a surcharge like this legal? And what are your thoughts surrounding that concerning consumer reaction?
Do you want me to go on that one first, Craig?
Sure, go for it.
We both went to law school. I'm not sure that either of us are really equipped to answer it.
We're very well equipped.
So it may not be legal in some places. Quebec in particular has some fairly strong consumer protection legislation that says the shelf price shall be the final price except for taxes. They will make an exception for the occasional eco fee, but they're fairly strict about what additional amounts you can charge. I think in other places in general. There's no maybe hard and fast legal prescription. I'd have to review the legislation in every province and may not actually go do that right now. But then there's the customer tolerance issue. You know, customers tend to like to know what they're going to pay, don't necessarily feel that great about getting an additional charge tacked on at the cash. I think if people, you know, these are inevitable input costs. And so people have to look at whether they can include those in prices, frankly. I realize that's an issue with respect to online competition, because obviously the same conditions don't bear on the online market. So that's going to be a tough call. But, you know, I would certainly suggest, you know, that people want to think long and hard about imposing a fee on consumers at the till.
Okay. And we're seeing it in different sectors. You know, hair salons are looking at doing this. Some consumers, you know, will be willing to pay a little bit extra. They understand that, you know, things are as they are. Some people just really want a haircut or whatever they're looking for. I think it'd be far more challenging, say, with a fashion retailer to have an additional fee, especially if a person can just go online and buy the item. The same for books and other items in that respect. From a consumer's, you know, perception standpoint, you know, many don't want additional fees generally. You know, if you think about such things as pay parking, you know, that's why suburban shopping centers can be so successful versus say something in an urban core, which has a fee. Shipping costs, you know, Amazon Prime is quite popular because it appears to, you know, have free shipping. I mean, there is obviously a fee that's paid, but you know, if a consumer is given a choice between paying a shipping cost on top of buying something and then having a shipping cost that appears to be free, very often the consumer will go with the free shipping. It's just our nature. We don't like additional costs. So I think that implementing, you know, these COVID-19 surcharges will be easier for some businesses than others if they are, you know, choosing to do so. To me, it makes sense. I mean, there's an increased cost in terms of PPE for these businesses. On top of that, you know, we expect generally a lower consumer spending number in retailers for a while. We are seeing that surge, but this morning I got an email from Savills, a brokerage which is around the world. They've got offices in China. They were reporting early on that there was a surge in spending. They call it revenge spending. People getting out and
I like the term.
getting out and getting excited and spending. They said this has dropped off, unfortunately. It's not the best news. So, you know, there was this excitement for a while. Now people are being a little bit more cautious. Foot traffic in the shopping centers and stores that are tracking that, which in China is most of them, is not nearly to what it was before. So even though we saw some very encouraging information initially from places like China, you know, it remains to be seen. I mean, you know, we'll have to watch the consumer to see how this goes. But back to the COVID fees, again, really, I think, you know, sector specific. On the one hand, you know, building the fee in may be a little bit less painful for the consumer, or at least something that they may not notice. But also, I think it's always good to be transparent. So I wouldn't encourage anyone to ever be dishonest in that respect either.
Right. We have a question that came in from one of our listeners, and maybe Karl, I know that you touched a little bit on that with regards to more regional legislation and governing bodies rather than letting the province make a decision with regards to that. Why, you know, since Quebec seems to be so much of a hot spot with their number of cases and deaths and whatnot, why do we think that they were amongst the first to start reopening stores outside of the Montreal area?
Yeah, I mean, they were and they weren't. There was a period where actually Quebec was the most stringent until Ontario revised its list of what were called essential businesses and actually took some out that had previously been considered essential. Well, there's a lot of people who would ask that question of the Premier of Quebec. Certainly the sort of, you know, rural-urban divide, there's significantly less presence. And you know, there were even musings at one point about essentially shutting down the island of Montreal and only allowing, you know, passage of essential workers and truck transport and so on. I can't necessarily determine why they've chosen to open up more broadly outside of Montreal, but I'm pretty sure that's based on health advice and the incidence of cases outside the island of Montreal.
Yeah, at the end of the day, I think it's really a provincial government decision and
Oh, yes.
level of risk, of course, right? Thank you.
Okay, so moving into a little bit different area, and this is going to be a particular interest to our retailers, and it has to do with sort of how promotional the marketplace is going to be. What's your expectation as to what's going to be happening with pricing for the remainder of the spring summer season?
Craig, why don't you go? That's more your sphere than mine.
Yeah. I mean, in some cases, for certain categories, we may see clearance sales. Where product being sold at a discount. What we've seen, say, with fashion retailers, for example, is they work currently, anyways, on a cycle. The spring season is pretty much finished. These retailers had to invest in that product. We may very well see, retailers discounting. There's, competition out there. If someone's doing it, someone else is going to be doing it as well. I've heard some brands tell me that they might look at trying to move some of that merchandise into spring 2021, which is interesting as well. So that could be a strategy there, maybe a little bit less money lost in terms of clearing things out. As well, if you think about it, I mean, some businesses are not going to survive as stores start to reopen. This is a time when a product can be cleared out, say if there's a bankruptcy filing or a restructuring or a shift. Otherwise, some stores are closing. So, it's interesting because on the one hand, we're saying we could have COVID-19 surcharges. Businesses will need a boost in revenue just to make it. But at the same time, we may see some discounting happening merely for the fact that others will be doing it. So this is going to be an added challenge for some categories in retail in the next little while.
All I would add to that, I mean, supply and demand is the first thing I would add to it. And so if, consumer demand is flat, businesses are going to have to think pretty seriously about promotional pricing. I'm skeptical that many, other than the deep pocketed, are going to defer kind of spring 2019 products to 2020. I mean, otherwise they're basically, paying for 2 sets of inventory at a time when they're otherwise obviously facing a number of costs, PPE costs, foot traffic issues, in some cases wage premiums. There's a multiple, set of input costs, and deferring your stock until next year means that basically you're carrying, 2 sets of inventory costs through the period. I suspect that the more common approach will be, moving that inventory out as much as possible.
I've actually been surprised personally in some of my discussions with a lot of retailers, because obviously with the time period at retail being lost over the last 10 weeks of closures, a lot of them are really interested in retaining as much margin as possible. Although the anticipation is that we're looking at probably, seeing some discounting happening in the market. I'm really finding that everyone's kind of holding back as much as possible for the time being. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next month. And especially, Craig, as you'd mentioned, with regards to the information from Savos, pent up demand, but how long is that going to last? Is it here for, a while? And I do hope that the findings are going to see things pick back up. But I think initially we'll all agree that it was all related to pent up demand, and we as humans consume. That's what we do, right? We did have a question from a retailer in Montreal, and Craig, during our conversation a couple of days ago, you'd mentioned about, shockingly, amidst the pandemic, we were talking about the, Fendi reporting record-breaking sales, which is shocking that a luxury brand could still, in a time where everyone's becoming increasingly conservative with their disposable income, that a brand like that could see that kind of reaction from their consumers. And this particular retailer is located in Montreal, and they're catering more to the dress market, which obviously no one's going anywhere right now, unfortunately. But we still have seen some pretty interesting patterns out there happen in the industry, haven't we, with regards to reaction towards certain brands?
Yeah. The case of that one brand, which was Fendi, they were, reaching out to their clients directly. It's called clienting. essentially, contacting them through apps to say, we've got the latest style of this and that, and in this case, this is a mono brand, luxury brand that comes out with new styles that are considered highly desirable to certain segments that buy luxury brands and are fans of this particular brand. They, were doing higher numbers, and surpassing targets without the physical location being open because they were reaching out to the consumer and they were buying these items. Again, some of these brands are very strong, Gucci, Louis Vuitton, they're able to do this. Not all brands are able to do it. One thing about wearing, dressed up clothes, unless you're on camera like I am a lot, they're not nearly as necessary right now. We're not going out and walking, in neighborhoods a whole lot, seeing and being seen. We're not, in many cases, going to our workplaces like we would have before in offices, and we're not attending, say, those charity galas or whatever people were dressing up for in the past. So again, the demand for dressier clothing, I would think, unless a person is an Instagram star and is on camera quite a bit, that demand would be considerably less. So I do know this is going to be a challenging time for some retailers and brands that typically would have seen pretty high sales. I mean, this month and into the spring and summer for me would have been a very busy time to go out and dress up and wear fancy clothes. And that I certainly wouldn't be doing that right now. And I'm not doing a whole lot of shopping right now personally.
Yeah.
Now, conversely, we understand that Lululemon is doing extremely well, which makes a certain intuitive sense given the kinds of apparel that people, the athleisure, appeal in this environment. So,
yeah, definitely.
Part of that might be the COVID-5 that some of us have gotten. So
5 kilos, right? Because
we are in Canada. One of the things that actually we have had happen is some of our people have been actually finding there's been a little bit of a shift from the consumer or the customer always being right, just with the change in the way things are going to have to be managed at the retail level, be it, having retail by appointment or any of those number of things. People saying, well, I can just return things whenever I see fit. What are your thoughts on this?
So on returns, so there's a couple of questions embedded in that, which is, relationships with customers as far as the customer is always right. And some of that, of course, is around the kind of physical control aspects and the admission aspects and the lineups and so on. And there have been some examples of friction, although most people are behaving pretty reasonably. But with respect to returns, I guess there are quite a few entities that are not accepting returns currently, and that's partly pending getting, guidance on just what to do, especially with soft goods. I would be cautioning people against taking a blanket no returns policy. One of the things that differentiates bricks and mortar retail from, the online behemoths is actually the ability to go in and make an exchange, try something on, take it home, bring it back. You lose that, and I think that one of the prime differentiators, prime is the word, I guess, one of the differentiators, it starts to slip away. So obviously you need appropriate protocols for handling returns, and you need appropriate staffing and so on, for reshelving and maybe quarantining in some cases for a period. But I would be really, really hesitant to take a blanket no return policy.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think you really risk, turning off the customer, but at the same time, there's the concern of sanitization of the product, right? And keeping the environment safe for everyone to shop in. One of the biggest challenges in speaking to a lot of retailers, and I'm sure we're all experiencing it on a certain level as well, is the challenges surrounding the staffing. We touched on that a little bit in our first question during the webinar, but with retail resuming now, there's a lot of personal situational issues with obviously, staff members being stuck with daycare, schooling challenges, whether they're caring for elderly parents. What exactly are the employer rights with regards to that? And Craig, I think I was listening in on the webinar yesterday that you were hosting, and it was interesting because that was in part a lot of what was discussed. But what exactly are the employer's rights with regards to that? And how are businesses adapting to meet these needs for their employees, and what rights do they have?
Do you want me to go first, or you want to go first, Craig?
Yeah, if you want to talk about the employer rights, that'd be interesting. And I could talk about the struggles of getting the employees back, and some of them not even wanting to come back.
So, I mean, in general, if somebody has work available to them and does not want to present themselves for work, it is open to the employer to seek corrective, sort of action and ultimately to dismiss them. There are exceptions to that. Obviously, the situation in which they're actually sick, you get into potential human rights issues with respect to accommodating disabilities. But for the most part, the people you're describing, I think, are mostly probably eligible for the CERB, the emergency benefit. And the emergency benefit, at least in theory, requires that you not have voluntarily left your employment or ceased taking shifts. It's an extremely porous system. It's an honor-based system based on an attestation. So you're certainly within your rights, presuming that this benefits you in any way, to say, well, if you're not showing up for work, I'm going to dismiss you. I'm not sure how that staffs your store, though, because in general, that's more a threat that you hope will be, or a threat, or at least a strong remonstrance that you hope will be met by somebody saying, okay, I'll come back. But if they don't come back, you've still got to do a new hire. So I'm not sure it cures your problem. I also think that retailers have to be realistic to the extent that people do have kids at home and there's no daycare and there's no, and there's no school and so on. I mean, obviously you're going, and particularly for employees that are valued, you're going to want to be as accommodating as possible. I think I'd be looking more at the CEWS program, which is the wage subsidy program, which of course covers new hires. There are quite a few people who've been disrupted by this environment. But I think certainly you're within your rights legally to say if somebody refuses work, then you can refuse to have them work for you. I just think you need to work through the practicalities on the margins and whether that will necessarily get you the labor force that you need.
Right.
That's right. So, the information that we got was something like 20% of the employees in the retail industry on the sales floor are not interested in even working in retail anymore. This will pose quite a bit of a challenge. On top of that, we've got a segment of the population that was a bit older that is thinking that they just may retire early, that this is the time for them to step out of that type of situation. And so regardless of what the law says, I mean, that's one thing. Terminating your employees could pose a tremendous challenge just generally, because how are you going to get new ones? This is going to be, challenging. You have to train these new employees. Perhaps the ones that you have that aren't wanting to come back yet for various concerns are highly skilled. They know the business culture. With that, from a practical standpoint, could result in the retailer not even being able to open. So from I think, letting the employees know that they're valued, having open communication, really, in some cases, the employees are going to be able to drive this because the employers really, really need them. On top of that, very often retail employees on the sales floor have worked for a minimum wage. There may have been a commission on top of that. We're not sure now if employees are going to be demanding more money. I know in the background there has been some, hiring and people moving around during this time. I mean, people weren't sitting around doing nothing for the time that the stores were closed. Some companies aggressively went out and hired staff from other businesses. So some of these employees won't even be coming back, partly because they're going to be working for someone else, possibly making more money, or just being somewhere else that they want to perhaps work for, or perhaps they see it as more advantageous. Maybe it's closer to home. They don't have to take the subway to, crowded subway to get there. So this, I think, is going to be a very challenging time for retailers to be able to say retain their employees that will be even returning at all. So very much, I think, a collaborative effort is going to be needed. And again, we did a webinar yesterday, and the expert on there said, maybe consider not firing your employees, keep the lines of communication open, and see where things go there, because this is really quite unprecedented in that respect.
Yeah.
So we just follow up on that just really quickly. I mean, we had when CERB came into being, obviously $2,000 a month, no cost of working, relative insulation from any ambient public health risk. was for those who were open, and it was particularly true in grocery, was pretty devastating in terms of work refusals, attrition in the workplace. And so we went to government and said, if you have a hard choice, you make $1, you lose 2,000, that's going to be pretty problematic in terms of getting even our part-timers to continue working part-time. And so the government revised the program and said, you can make $1,000 and still get your serve. And of course, we immediately had complaints. Well, now I'm asking, having people asking me to cut to 20 hours or something like that. But I think of the problems, that is the lesser of the problems. Yeah. I think the reality is that for a certain number of employees, just the ambient public health concerns are such, they're not coming back. Obviously, that situation where you are allowed to get served and also earn up to $1,000 part-time, at least provides some potential labor force motivation to come back into the workplace. So, and of course, the employers can actually, if they're eligible, can get the wage subsidy for that $1,000 as well. So that's at least one avenue. It's by no means a cure-all.
That's right. It's almost like a complete, restart, reshuffle. There's so many different, situations at play here, and there's so many different variables at play that, we'll continue, to Craig's point, we'll continue to see a lot of shuffling around with employees, despite times not already challenging enough, unfortunately.
Well, I mean, certainly there is a fear for a lot of people in retail to come back to work. And actually, one of the next questions that we had was posed by a retailer. And that was to say, what happens if a staff member tests positive for COVID-19? And is there a government-led protocol in place to deal with that situation?
So we've got some coverage of that actually in our playbook, and I'm not the expert on this piece. I mean, first, you're presuming that somebody who has been coming to work test positive, as opposed to somebody who's not yet done so. So the normal process is actually at this stage that it is you obviously ask the employee to seek medical assistance and not to return to work until that process is worked through. And in general, there are protocols for that, like don't walk into a sitting room in a doctor's office, call ahead. There are particular centers for them to go to, obviously get tested, because you don't know that's the first issue. So it may not even be that they've tested positive for COVID-19, but rather that they're symptomatic. To the extent that somebody tests positive, there are a variety of different protocols in terms of contact tracing and so forth. So they really vary by province, but obviously you're going to want to think about contact points. You may want to then urge others who have been in contact to themselves get tested and so forth. We do have a bit of guidance on that on our site. I wish I were more expert on it, but I don't have kind of the universal answer. Craig may well be able to add something on top of that.
I mean, I'm not an expert either, but we have certainly seen in the news, businesses closing temporarily. They're doing cleaning. Very often, it seems to have been grocery stores, a little bit up to a less degree, but still, drug stores, convenience stores, liquor stores. These are the retailers that haven't really shut down during this time. So we may see more cases in these deemed non-essential retailers, but it's I'm just thinking, I'm not sure what the protocols would be, but I mean, given that I think there would be a quarantining protocol, it would
vary by province, Craig, and it's weird. Like in some cases they're saying 10 days since a positive test and 2 days after any evident symptoms, and then others are 14, so it's not even a universal standard.
Yeah, it's complicated. On top of that now, and I don't think the law has been passed, but they're looking at it, was it a 10-day paid sick period that businesses would have to pay employees for anything. But in this case, if a person has a concern around having COVID-19, I mean, that's an extra expense for businesses as well on top of everything else.
Right.
Yeah, that one's not quite as clear cut as that. And it's going back and forth. So this really was driven by organized labor and a number of employee advocacy groups. And the push, of course, for a long period has been to have a lot more paid sick days. And that has vacillated back and forth. We saw that certainly in Ontario, where there was legislation that was then repealed. So there was a push in BC in particular that tended to lead this charge, although it's come up elsewhere. And what the Premier of BC, Premier Horgan, accepted from business associations is the last thing that they need at this point is to be taking on another 10 days of paid sick leave in the environment in which they find themselves. So in fact, the exhortation to the Prime Minister, which was also done in the House of Commons, was to find a solution, certainly for now, through the CERB benefit, not on an employer paid basis. And there's quite a bit of advocacy to have this captured within EI. Which is obviously, you know, employers contribute, but, you know, EI or the general tax base would diffuse the impact of that as opposed to employer paid. So I don't think it's a settled issue that it's going to land on employers, but obviously there's a concern that if they don't find another vehicle through the EI system or through CERB or through general, you know, general programs, that it might fall on retailers. So I think that one's still a bit up in the air.
Yeah. And amongst all of kind of the murkiness that's happening right now with regards to, you know, protocols and nothing definitive being set by government agencies as far as how to regulate these things, is also, you know, the, you know, I guess with safety at retail, both for employees and customers shopping in the stores. You know, safety is now kind of the new fashion du jour, where everyone is really, it's what are you doing as a business to show that you're being safe and sanitized, and is your staff wearing PPE? Some businesses are opting, some retailers are opting to make PPE mandatory for their staff. Others are not. Others are making it mandatory for anyone walking into the store. So how, you know, there's really kind of a blurred line here where it's not being regulated or mandated by the government. So it's leaving every retailer kind of up to its own interpretation or level of comfort to judge what's best for their business. And in essence, some will argue that it's also somewhat leaving them or putting them at risk of criticism from the general public, depending on which way they decide to sway. Why do we think that the government hasn't actually issued a standardized, you know, regulation surrounding that?
Do you want me to go, or you want to go, Craig?
Please do, Karl. Yeah, please go.
So it comes down to two things. I mean, I think there's been broad recommendations from government with respect to physical distance, and in some cases required physical distance, in some cases stipulated occupancy during a period. Public health authorities have been quite assertive around, you know, the availability of hand sanitizers to the extent that it is available, the sanitization of surfaces. So it's not that there haven't been any guidance. The area where it's been a bit more tenuous has been with respect to masks, and particularly masks, in general use. And I mean, I don't want to consume the rest of it, of the webinar on that, but in essence, there are a lot of public health officials were skeptical, at least at the outset, about the value of masks, mainly because people who are not healthcare professionals don't really know how to wear them. And they have a tendency to touch their face and adjust their masks, and they're touching the very areas that are, you know, mucous membranes and are actually susceptible to anything that people have picked up. They've revised their view a bit. It's almost like a sort of, you know, masks don't protect you, but they protect others. But if everybody wears one, then everybody is therefore somewhat protected. They've evolved that view since the U.S. Center for Disease Control evolved it. Quebec has actually gone all the way from don't wear them to really you should, but there are others who've gone that route. I think that the reality is, for most medical professionals' perspective, this is still really about the basics. Wash your hands, clean contact areas, keep physical distance to a 2-meter level. Those are so much, you know, practice respiratory etiquette. Those are so much still the sort of main, methods of avoiding transmission, and that the masks are frankly seen as a bit of, if not window dressing, they're additive to that, but they're not the core issue.
Optics, yeah. Okay.
Well, I happen to have one of those health professionals in my home, and she said since she has to do PPE every time she has to do a shift, I'm wearing it whenever I go out. So just letting you know.
Oh, boy.
Okay, thank you guys, and Janelle. Now, let's talk a little bit, and we've sort of touched on some of the things with the CERB programs and the like. And with respect to government-funded programs, I mean, do you have any speculations on what's going to happen for the wage subsidy programs or the rent relief programs with respect to extensions and the like?
So, yeah, in fact, I'm actually heavily engaged in the discussions on the wage subsidy currently. So that's probably the one that's easiest to speak about. So we have exhorted government, and government wasn't hard to persuade, that the wage subsidy needs to evolve from something with a hard 30% or greater revenue loss cliff to something that obviously recognizes that we're in a recovery period, and therefore you recover, you recover by 1 percentage point, you get pushed out of the program. That's actually going to be pretty problematic. So they are certainly contemplating what you would call a ramp. And it may be that, the deeper you are on the ramp, the more generous the subsidy, the closer you climb towards pre-existing revenues, somewhat less generous subsidy. And obviously they'll top it out at some level. They're not going to allow you to get back to 100% while continuing to receive the sort of drip feed of the wage subsidy program. They are also looking at something else, and we'll see tomorrow, actually have a big discussion, which is right now the wage subsidy program is confined in these silos of a month and a month and a month. And in a recovery period, it's not sure, it doesn't necessarily make sense that they would do that. In many ways, somebody who's been down 80%, down 70%, down 60 is in a very different position than somebody who was down 15 and then 30 and so on and is now coming back up. And so they may look at it more like they look like the loss carry forward provisions in the Income Tax Act, and essentially look at your cumulative loss that would entitle you perhaps to a greater level of subsidy than somebody who'd had less of a cumulative loss, and then you can track that as against your reopening. It's also important to remember a lot of people aren't reopened. If you're Cineplex, take a case in point, you are closed, you do not have an online offering, it's going to be a while. Why should you be forced into these artificial buckets of this month, next month? You don't have anybody working right now. You should frankly be able to deploy that as against your own trajectory for recovery. So I think that they'll be thinking about some of that as well.
And with the way the rent relief, I think that we saw small and medium-sized businesses maximum $50,000 a month rent. Through Canada Housing and Mortgage, a bit of a rent relief there. I think Karl, and you could mention this as well, that bigger retailers may be getting some relief at some point as well.
Yeah, that is like, that's like the gestation period of an elephant before that thing is delivered. The Prime Minister pops out in front of the Rideau Cottage. And I'll be frank. I mean, they understand the problem for retail. They understand the ecosystem that involves retailers, obviously, 2 million plus employees, commercial landlords, the pension beneficiaries and shareholders who, derive income from those. So they understand the challenge. And they understand how hard hit retail is. Where they have difficulty is in providing something to retail that they're also not prepared to, necessarily prepared to provide to travel or tourism or hospitality or oil and gas. I mean, we're not obviously the only negatively affected industry. And so they have these broad programs. And I actually think now they're looking at things like the wage subsidy program and trying to figure out, well, can we do rent relief by another means, by doing a carve out for e-commerce or whatever the case might be, something that recognizes the fact that the physical assets, the bricks and mortar, if you like, have been shuttered. I'm not sure that's a thing they'll do, by the way, but they're looking at every other delivery method because their challenge is, how do I say to an airline, you're on this leave program and that's all you get, lender of last resort, fairly strenuous, fairly significant interest rates, and then turn around and say to the retail industry, well, here's some cheap money to help you, and if you do a deal with your landlord. So it is challenging to deliver that program, and I think that they're casting around for potential alternatives.
In some of my recent conversations with retailers is with regards, and the biggest level of criticism that I've heard in the industry is with regards to the commercial rent relief program and how it's been structured, leaving it up to the landlord's discretion whether they want to apply or not. Some landlords, in particular with retail rent, have opted or have stated that they are not planning on applying for that, and therefore their tenant is essentially stuck and not offered a whole lot of support where there is a program and a system that is made available should the landlord choose to participate. Is there is there any mechanisms that are set into place to ensure good faith negotiations between landlord and tenants? Because program seems.
Craig and Retail Insider and Mario, who writes on this a lot, have covered it. So I don't want to. I want to take up all the oxygen here. So there's nothing that compels a landlord, and I don't think it's likely that a landlord would ever be directly compelled. You must sign on to the program. There are a few things that they could do. One, and we've called for it, as have a number of other associations, is to bring in a moratorium on commercial evictions, and indeed on other forms of harassment like changing the locks and seizure of goods and so on. It's a pretty generous program. It's 75% of the rent paid on time versus a lot of uncertainty, probably a lot of litigation, driving a bunch of your tenants into bankruptcy or driving them out of their, out of their current occupancy and then having empty space and so on. It is a pretty generous package. So one of the things that could happen is governments could say, and it's all in provincial jurisdiction in this case, you don't give up your long-term legal rights, but you can't evict anybody right now, nor can you impede them in their reopening. I think that'll focus a lot of landlords' minds on just how generous the package is. One other option, and certainly some groups have advanced this, is give the 50%, which is essentially the government contribution, to the tenant. Even if it's given, for a particular landlord and rooted by the tenant. And at a minimum, then at least we've been able to deploy that. So we've been able to pay 50% of the rent. Right now, it's kind of all or nothing. I don't know that they'll do that. This is the first week that CECRA program, the commercial rent program, has actually been in effect for applications. I think they're going to take a good hard look after this week to determine what the take up is and whether they need to make some tweaks to the program.
Okay.
And I've spoken to quite a few retailers and brokers, and there have been endless and constant negotiations happening behind the scenes. Brokers may not necessarily be getting paid for this time, but they're working very hard with retailers big and small, trying to create some sort of negotiation between the retailer and landlord to make things work, because ultimately, say if you're a shopping center landlord, you lose a whole bunch of your tenants because they've gone under. How are you going to fill that space again? I mean, it's kind of a lose-lose situation. So again, from that practical standpoint, trying to partner and work this out, I think is really important. A very substantial number of retailers with major landlords did not pay rent for this month and even in months prior. So this already is a really challenging situation, and it's challenging for everyone. Landlords have certain obligations around payments that they have to make, not to mention quite a few landlords are pension fund owned as well, be it Ontario Teachers Pension or otherwise. So they've got their obligations at their end. Businesses that are within these properties are themselves trying to fight to survive, and it's been very challenging. And there's been some very hurt relationships at the same time. I've spoken to many retailers that are furious with landlords for not giving concessions and for standing their ground at a time when retailers felt that they were carrying the brunt of this. And a lot of retailers paid their employees for the 2 weeks after stores closed. That was a cost. Some retailers incurred inventory costs, which are hitting them on top of that, especially fashion. But now having to pay the rents on top of that when they have very little to no retail sales, is sinking retailers fast. Some were in such a challenging cash position that they were almost immediately put into a situation where they were insolvent. And I think we will unfortunately see quite a bit more of that. I spoke to one retailer who said even at zero rent, they were still stood to lose money out of this. And that is going to be a challenge. So but from a practical standpoint, I think, partnerships are going to be very, very important just generally in the next while.
If we can take that theme just a little bit further, if we've got time. First, I don't want to demonize all landlords. There have been some progressive landlords who have recognized not only their, the relationship they have with their tenants, but also their long-term economic interests. So maybe I come back to that. So it's not universal. And of course, as Craig's pointed out, I mean, you've got people who have their own mortgages. You've got people who have their own obligations. It's their sole income, particularly for smaller landlords. And, you can certainly see that. But all that said, you have to look at who's taking the haircut here. If retailers have been shut, the very thing that landlords rent to them, which is their physical space, has essentially been closed by public mandate. And if a landlord is assuming employees and the retailer buyers, then I think landlords are deluding themselves. That's a reasonable apportionment. But more importantly, they need to not only look at their strict legal rights, but they need to look at their long-term economic interests. As Craig said, I mean, if you've got tumbleweeds blowing through your mall a few years hence because you took too hard a line with your, with your tenants, then are you the net beneficiary of that? I presume not. So people have to look at, there's a sort of symbiotic relationship here. And if you don't nurture that, then there's going to be a lot of consequences for the landlord community over the medium and long term economically.
So do you see moving forward a greater inclination for retailers to try and have percentage rent deals as opposed to a fixed cost?
Yeah, I do.
And
I think the whole simplicity of triple net rent and stuff like that is, funnily enough, that's actually been a bit of a problem for the secret program. But yeah, I think the simplicity of that may be a whole lot less appealing. I don't know that we're through all of the super bugs that will ever exist in human history or similar situations. I can certainly see now people would build in a little more of a buffer.
Yeah, I know. I've spoken to retailers. They're saying that, percentage rent is the way that they want to go. That isn't necessarily the best thing for landlords. Now, I know some shopping center landlords, I won't say which one, for confidentiality, but they had actually shifted properties before COVID-19 to percentage rent for new tenants. And one of the reasons for that was things for a lot of retailers were actually slowing down before COVID-19 hit. I tracked over 1,000 individual store locations that have been set to close in the first quarter of 2020 before we knew that these store closures were going to happen. This was back in January. This was already a challenging time. So some landlords working out deals for percentage rent plus capital cost on top of that for these tenants. Now I think that, a lot of retailers are going to ask for percentage rent. At the same time, some have, fixed leases, which may be challenging to get out of. On top of that, again, they're talking about such things as pandemic clauses within leases or something similar to that in terms of there's been force majeure clauses or act of God clauses, which have resulted in these rents having to still be technically paid, even though these businesses have been shut. So again, I think that perhaps the way that leases are going to be written moving forward or negotiated as they currently exist may change in the future, and certainly already have for some retailers at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Thank you to you both, Craig, Karl. Your information, insight into what's happening has been tremendous for our industry. So I really do want to say thank you on behalf of everyone for participating today. And again, Craig Patterson from Retail Insider and Karl Littler from RCC, Retail Council of Canada, both incredibly valuable information on both websites. Please take time to visit that. And of course, on our own website, afacanada.com. We will also be launching the opening of membership on Monday for both retailers and our suppliers to register on afa.com. So please make sure to check it out and follow us on social media, Facebook and LinkedIn. Thanks again, gentlemen. Be well, everyone.
Thank you.